If you won't help this family, you're not part of this family.
I've been paying rent here for 3 years.
And we've been feeding you, housing you, putting up with you. We're done.
You won't last a week out there.
Then I guess we'll see.
Change the locks tonight.
They watched me walk away from that curb like it was settled. Like throwing someone's belongings onto the front steps of a house they'd been paying for was the kind of thing you could do without consequence. Mara had her hand on the door before I reached the end of the block. Brandon was already inside. Gordon hadn't come to the door at all. The three of them had just dismantled the only home I had, and from where they were standing, they had every reason to believe I wasn't coming back. They were right about one part. The woman who left that night wasn't coming back. What was coming back would own the ground they were standing on. If you've ever been the person a family leaned on until there was nothing left and then blamed when you finally stopped, this story is for you. Subscribe and stay with this one. What happens next took years to build, and it is worth every minute. I want to tell you something about the way I left that night because I think people misunderstand it. I didn't leave because I was brave. I didn't have some quiet certainty that everything was going to work out or that I was walking towards something better. I left because staying would have required me to become someone I couldn't afford to be, someone who once again absorbed the consequences of other people's choices and called it love. I had been doing that for 3 years inside that house. I had been doing it for most of my life before that. And somewhere between watching Mara's hand go to the doorknob and hearing the deadbolt click from the inside, I understood that the cost of going back was higher than the cost of walking away. So I walked away. And I want to be honest, it felt like losing. It felt exactly like losing. The neighborhood was a collection of 24 houses arranged around 2 intersecting streets in a part of the city that had been left alone for long enough that it had developed its own logic. The houses were old enough to have character, deep porches, mismatched window frames, trees that had grown up through the cracks of what used to be sidewalks. And they all belonged to the same company. A private real estate firm that had been operating for decades and had long since stopped caring what the properties looked like. The management was slow, the maintenance was slower, and the rent was just low enough that people stayed even when the pipes rattled and the heating took longer than it should to come on in November. Mara had lived there for 11 years and talked about the house as if it were hers in a way that went beyond tenancy. She spoke about the porch like she'd built it, about the backyard like she'd planted every inch of it, about the neighborhood like she'd chosen it instead of simply staying because leaving was difficult and the rent hadn't gone up in 3 years. I think she believed it, which is the part that made it complicated. I moved in after my employer eliminated my position in a round of cuts that took out an entire department in a single afternoon. I had 6 weeks of severance, a storage unit I was paying for, and no immediate plan. Mara's offer, come stay, save money, get back on your feet, sounded temporary because it was presented that way and because I wanted it to be. What I didn't understand at the time was that temporary was not a category Mara recognized once an arrangement had proved useful. The first few months were straightforward. I paid rent. I bought groceries. I kept to myself and looked for work and mostly stayed out of the way of Gordon, who was quiet and benign and largely absent from any decision-making, and Brandon, who was 27, and operated as though the concept of consequences was something that happened to other people. Then Mara handed me the utility bill one morning without any particular ceremony and said she'd had a lot to think about and thought it would make sense for us to split it. I paid it. The following month it was the utility bill and a plumber's invoice for a pipe that had needed fixing. I paid that too. By the end of the year, I was managing the household finances almost entirely, not because anyone had asked me to explicitly, but because the alternative was watching things lapse and then being held responsible for the lapse anyway. This is how it worked in that house. Nothing was ever directly assigned. Things simply accumulated around me until they became mine by default, and the moment I pointed this out, I became the person making things difficult. The neighbors knew me before they knew my last name, which I mention because it matters later. Mrs. Del next door knocked on our door one afternoon with a maintenance form she didn't know how to fill out, and I sat with her at her kitchen table and walked her through it. Word traveled the way it does in small neighborhoods, and within a few months, I was the person people came to when the management company wasn't returning calls, which was most of the time. I learned which units had chronic pipe issues. I learned which families had been waiting months for repairs the company kept promising. I learned the names of people the management company seemed to have forgotten existed. I also learned over time that the company's record-keeping was a mess, and that the properties had been generating less revenue than they should have been for years. I noticed this the way I noticed most things, not because I was looking for it, but because when you're doing the administrative work that makes a household function, you start to see patterns. The company wasn't just poorly managed. It was failing in a slow, grinding way that nobody on the outside had noticed yet. I filed that away and thought nothing more of it. Brandon's problems were not new. They were a recurring feature of life in that house, like the loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet that never quite got fixed. Present acknowledged, then absorbed back into the baseline. He had a gift for generating situations that required someone else to resolve them, and he had been exercising that gift for long enough that the family had built an entire system around managing his fallout. The system worked because of me. I understood this in the abstract, but had never tested what would happen if I stepped out of it. What broke things open was the rent. Brandon had borrowed money against a debt in Gordon's name without telling Gordon, and when the lender came looking and the money wasn't there, he took the rent I had given Mara for March, April, and May and used it to settle the most immediate part of what he owed. Mara discovered this when the management company sent a notice threatening to terminate their lease. She did not tell the management company that Brandon had taken the money. She told me I needed to cover the 3 months. The number she gave me, 3 months of rent late fees and the administrative charge the company added 4 notices, was the better part of my remaining savings. It was also not my debt. Brandon had taken the money. The debt belonged to him. I said so. Not dramatically, not with any kind of ultimatum. I just said it clearly in the kitchen on a Wednesday evening and told Mara that if Brandon had taken the rent money, Brandon needed to be the one to address it. I said he should sell the car he'd bought 6 months ago with money I still didn't know the origin of. I said he should get a job, a real one, with a paycheck and make a plan. Mara looked at me the way she looked at things she found inconvenient and said I was being selfish. Gordon was in the room. He heard all of it. He looked at the table and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The argument that ended with me on the sidewalk didn't start as one argument. It was more like several smaller arguments that had been accumulating for years, and on that particular night they all arrived at once. Mara said I had always put myself first. She said I had taken the security of living in that house without ever truly contributing. She said, and this was the one that I remember most clearly because it was the most precisely wrong, that everything she had ever done, she had done for this family, and the least I could do was return the favor. I told her that I had been returning the favor for 3 years. I told her I had the receipts literally, and that if she wanted to sit down and go through them together, I was willing to do that. She wasn't interested in the receipts. What happened next was the part I've described in the hook, so I won't repeat the details. The suitcase, the steps, Brandon in the doorway, the lock clicking into place while I stood on the porch with my hand on the handle of the bag. What I want to tell you about is the 40 seconds after that when I was standing on the sidewalk in front of the house and I made myself look at it very carefully. I looked at the porch light that I had replaced in October because Mara said it was too dark and she was worried about safety. I looked at the mailbox that I had restaked into the ground after a storm bent the post. I looked at the number beside the door and thought about the 3 years of rent checks I had written to a company that had never once sent anyone to fix the drainage issue in the backyard that flooded every spring. Then I looked at the 23 other houses on those 2 streets, and I thought about Mrs. Delgado and her maintenance forms and the family in number 14 whose heating had been broken for 6 weeks, and the retired couple in number 20 who had stopped asking the management company for anything because they'd been told no so many times they'd accepted it as permanent. I picked up my suitcase. I walked to the end of the block. I did not look back, which was the right decision at the time and which I don't regret. But I kept the picture of those streets in my head. Precise, detailed, complete. The way I keep things I think I might need later. Claire had a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like someone's cooking from the moment you stepped into the elevator, which was the kind of detail that would have been annoying in other circumstances, and which in those first few weeks I found genuinely comforting. She gave me the couch without making it feel like charity, and asked only that I tell her when I'd figured out the next step. I spent 2 weeks in something I can only describe as a kind of suspended state, functioning, eating, sleeping, applying for jobs, but without the full sense that I was actually present in my own life. I knew what had happened. I understood it. I just needed a few weeks before the understanding arrived in my body as well as my head. What got me moving again was oddly anger. Not the hot kind I'd already had that on the sidewalk, and it had done its job. This was the colder kind, the kind that settles in and becomes useful, that turns into a question. What are you going to do with this? What I did was take a job at a property management company that a former colleague had mentioned in passing almost as an afterthought, the kind of job offer that doesn't feel significant until later when you trace the shape of how your life changed. I took it because it was available and because my options were limited. And within the first month, I understood that everything I had been doing in that house for 3 years, managing money, negotiating with contractors, tracking maintenance timelines, reading the fine print of lease agreements had prepared me for this work in ways that formal training hadn't prepared some of my colleagues. I was good at it. Not immediately, not effortlessly, but with the particular competence that comes from having learned something by doing it under pressure with real consequences attached. I didn't go back to the neighborhood. I didn't call Mara. Occasionally, a number I recognized would appear on my phone and I would let it go to voicemail and then delete the message without listening to it, which tells you something about where I was at the time. Not closed exactly, but not open in the way that would have been required to have that conversation. I kept moving forward. That was the only direction that made sense. The property management work led to a specialization in distressed properties buildings and neighborhoods that had been mismanaged long enough that they'd reached a kind of crisis point where the gap between what they could be and what they currently were had become too large to ignore. I learned how to read a failing portfolio the way other people learn to read financial statements, which signs meant temporary trouble, which meant structural collapse, which meant opportunity. I was promoted within 18 months. I was running projects within 3 years. By the time I had enough saved to start thinking about something of my own, I had also accumulated something harder to quantify, a reputation for taking things apart carefully enough to understand them and putting them back together in ways that actually worked. I tell you all of this not to establish a success story because this isn't that kind of story. I tell you because I want you to understand who I was when the call came. Not the woman who had left with a suitcase and nowhere to go, but also not someone who had left that night behind entirely. I had built something real. I had done it with my own hands and my own thinking, and a willingness to stay in the uncomfortable parts of problems until I found the exit. But I had not forgotten where I'd come from. I had simply stopped letting it be the whole story. Then, one afternoon, scrolling through a distressed asset listing that had come across my desk, I saw an address I recognized. Not one address. 24 of them. 2 intersecting streets. A package sale from a company in the middle of a bankruptcy proceeding, managed so poorly for so long that the accumulated failures had finally reached a terminal point. I read the listing twice. Then I closed my laptop, got up, made coffee, came back, and opened it again. The streets were exactly as I remembered them. The properties were exactly as troubled as I had suspected all those years ago when I was filling out maintenance forms at Mrs. Delgado's kitchen table. And a development company, the kind that tears things down rather than fixing them, had already made an inquiry. I sat with that for about 30 seconds. Then I started making calls. The calls I made that afternoon were the kind you make when you already know what you want to do, and you're looking for someone to tell you it's possible. My business partner, a man named Dennis, who had co-invested with me on 2 previous projects, picked up on the second ring. I told him what I'd found. He asked 3 questions: the asking price, the condition of the underlying assets, and who else had made inquiries. When I answered all 3, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "It was aggressive but not insane." Coming from Dennis, who had the risk appetite of someone who had watched 3 deals collapse in a single year, that was close to enthusiasm. The development company that had already made an inquiry was offering to buy the entire portfolio for a number that made sense on paper if your plan was to demolish everything and build luxury units. Their timeline was fast because their offer was clean cash, no conditions, and no interest in what happened to the people currently living there. The bankruptcy court was motivated to close quickly. Every day the properties sat unresolved was another day of liability for the estate. I had a window. It was not a large window. The financing took most of the next 6 weeks. I put in my own savings, which was a number I had built deliberately over several years, and which I was now committing with the full knowledge that if this failed, I would be starting over in a way that would be harder at this point in my life than it had been the first time. The bank required a business plan, a rehabilitation timeline, and projections showing that the rents could cover the debt service while staying affordable enough that I wasn't simply replicating the problem the development company would have created. This was the part where my specific experience mattered. I had spent years doing exactly this kind of analysis for other people's properties. I knew what deferred maintenance actually cost to address, which was always more than the previous owner had accounted for, and I knew how to model a realistic timeline that would hold up to scrutiny. The bank's underwriting team pushed back on 2 items. I revised the projections, brought in additional documentation, and came back with numbers they could approve. My investment partners came in after the bank, which is typically how these things work. Institutional money first, then the people who know you well enough to take the gap on faith. Dennis brought in 2 others. I presented the full plan to all 3 of them in a single meeting that lasted 90 minutes and ended with handshakes and a signed term sheet. The development company outbid us in the first round. I want to be honest about that moment because it would be easy to skip past it. They came in higher, their offer was cleaner, and for approximately 48 hours I thought we had lost. What changed was not a miracle. It was the bankruptcy court's trustees who had a fiduciary obligation to consider more than the highest number. A credible rehabilitation plan with committed financing and a documented track record from the lead investor was something they were required to evaluate. My attorney, a thorough woman named Sandra Kowalski, who had handled 3 of my previous closings, made sure the court understood exactly what the development company's plan meant for the existing tenants versus what mine meant. The court chose mine. I signed the closing documents on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room downtown with Sandra on one side and Dennis on the other. And when it was done, I went home and made dinner and went to bed early because I had an early morning and there was a great deal of work ahead. The first time I drove back to those streets as the owner, I went alone. It was a Sunday early enough that most people were still inside. I parked at the end of the block where I used to live and walked the length of both streets slowly, the way I would walk any property I was about to begin rehabilitating, looking at the gutters, the siding, the condition of the walks, the places where deferred maintenance had been allowed to accumulate into something more serious. I had done this professionally dozens of times, and I knew how to read what I was seeing. What I was not prepared for was the particular feeling of reading it here. I knew this street in a way I had never known any of the other properties I'd worked on. I knew which house had the pipe that froze in a hard winter. I knew which porch light buzzed when it rained because the fixture wasn't sealed properly. I knew the sound the wind made when it came through the gap in the fence at the back of number 7 because I had heard it from my bedroom window for 3 years. I stood in front of the house where I had lived and looked at it for a long time. The porch light I had replaced was still there, though the bulb had gone out again. The mailbox post I had restaked was listing slightly to the left. The house looked the same as it always had, not dramatically deteriorated, not dramatically improved. Just the same as if the years I had spent inside it had made no visible impression on the outside. Then I went to my car, got out my laptop, and opened the property management software I had already set up for the portfolio. The first task on my list was to schedule a full structural and systems assessment for all 24 units. The second was to set up the on-site management office that every professionally run residential portfolio requires. And the third, the one I added while sitting in that car looking at that house, was to install a security camera system and digital records management as part of the initial setup. I want to be clear about why I did that last one. It was not intuition about what was coming. It was not suspicion about any specific person. It was standard practice. Every property I had taken over in the previous 3 years had received the same setup on day 1 because documented baselines protect you when things go wrong, and things always go wrong during a rehabilitation. Cameras at entry points, digital logs for access, records of who came and went and when. Nothing unusual, nothing that required any particular foresight. I am telling you this now because of what it meant later. I went to Mara's door on a weekday morning, which I had chosen deliberately. I brought Sandra with me, and one of the property managers I had hired, a calm and competent woman named Denise, who had done tenant communications on 2 previous projects. We were not there to announce anything dramatic. We were there because the new ownership needed to introduce itself to all residents, and Mara's house was one of 24 stops on the circuit. Mara opened the door in a way that told me she had been watching from the window. Her face went through something when she saw me. Not one emotion, but several in a sequence that happened faster than she could organize. She recovered quickly the way she always had. She said my name like it was a question. I said I wasn't here as her daughter. I told her I was here because I was the new property owner and I needed to introduce myself to all current tenants. I said it in the same tone Denise used for every other door on the street, professional, clear, without effect. Mara looked at Sandra. She looked at Denise. She looked back at me. I said, I'm not coming home. I'm here to inspect my property. That sentence and the specific way she went still when she heard it is the moment I carry with me when I think about what happened. Not because it felt like victory. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the completion of something that had started on a sidewalk years ago. Something I hadn't known was going to take this particular shape, but which now that it had made a kind of sense, I couldn't have articulated in advance. We finished the tenant circuit. I went back to the office. I kept working. What Mara did next was predictable, which doesn't make it any less damaging. She started with Brandon, who had his own grievances. He had come to me separately in the first week, presenting himself as a candidate for on-site management, with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. I told him I had already hired Denise for the management role and that the position wasn't available. He left without saying much, but the set of his jaw told me everything about what was coming. Brandon told the neighbors I had bought the property to get revenge. He said I was going to raise the rents until everyone left and then sell to the development company I had outbid. He was specific and he was persuasive and he was operating on the correct assumption that most people's first instinct when they hear something frightening is to believe it. Mara organized what she called community meetings held at the house with the people who had known her longest and trusted her most. She didn't come to these meetings as the woman who had thrown her daughter's belongings onto a porch. She came as a longtime resident, a familiar face, someone who had watched out for this neighborhood when nobody else cared. She told a story in which she was the one trying to protect everyone from an outside force. The outside force being her own daughter who had come back not to help but to control. Some people believed her. I understood why. She was good at this. She had been good at it for as long as I could remember. The practical effect was that when my repair crews went to schedule their initial assessments, several residents declined to let them in. 2 families who had been on the waiting list for maintenance that had been deferred for years turned down the appointments. The work I needed to do to bring the properties up to standard was being blocked by the same people the work was meant to help, because someone had convinced them I couldn't be trusted. Gordon found me on the street one afternoon, which surprised me. Gordon had always been the kind of person who avoided the center of any conflict. He told me he knew Brandon had been the one to take the rent money years ago. He said it quietly, standing beside a car that wasn't his, not quite meeting my eyes. He said he hoped I understood that he'd been trying to keep the peace and that it hadn't been about not caring what happened to me. Then he asked me if I would consider handling the situation with the property in a way that kept things quiet for Mara's sake. I looked at him for a moment. Then I told him I would treat every tenant in the portfolio according to the same standard and that I didn't have a different process for any particular household. I walked back to the management office. Brandon's escalation came about 6 weeks into the rehabilitation. He broke into the management office on a night when no one was there and took a file box of paper maintenance records, duplicates as it turned out, because I had already digitized everything, but he didn't know that. 2 days later, the electrical system in Unit 17, which had been vacant while repairs were underway, showed signs of interference that the electrician flagged immediately. It wasn't subtle damage. It was the kind of thing that, if discovered in a formal inspection, would raise serious questions about the safety of the entire portfolio. Which was the point? Brandon had heard enough of the industry language over the past few weeks to understand that a failed safety inspection could freeze the rehabilitation and potentially trigger the bank to reconsider the loan. The inspection came. The electrical issue in Unit 17 was flagged. The bank placed a temporary hold on further disbursements pending a full assessment. My partners called. The residents fed a steady diet of anxiety by Mara, and Brandon's narrative took the news as confirmation that the project was falling apart. Mara told anyone who would listen that I had brought chaos to a neighborhood that had been stable before I showed up. I sat in the management office that evening with Denise and Claire, who had come down to help, and I looked at what I was working with. A bank hold of blocked repair schedule partners who were nervous residents who were frightened and suspicious, and a family that was willing to damage their own neighborhood to prevent me from being the one who fixed it. I understood then what I had understood in a smaller way on the sidewalk years ago. There was no version of this where I protected their version of events, and also did the work I had come here to do. I had been making a space for their side of the story, even when their side of the story was wrong, because that was the habit I had built across a lifetime of living alongside them. The habit was finished. What came next was going to require a different approach entirely. I told Claire to pull the security footage from the management office for the night of the break-in. I opened the digital access logs, and I started building the picture that I would carry into the meeting I had already decided to call. The residents' meeting was held in the community room of Unit 1, which had a large enough common area to fit most of the adults from the 24 households. I had sent written notice to every unit 3 days in advance. The notice said the meeting was to address the current status of the rehabilitation project and to answer questions directly. It did not say anything about Brandon or about what I had found in the security footage because I had learned a long time ago that people who arrive expecting a confrontation rarely hear anything else. Most people came. I had expected that when someone tells you that your housing situation is in danger, you show up to find out why. Mara came, which I had also expected. She sat toward the front on the left side in the chair that gave her the best view of the room and the best angle to read the audience. Brandon was not there, which I had also expected, though, for different reasons. I stood at the front of the room with Denise on one side and a physical folder of documents on the table beside me. I did not bring Sandra to this meeting because this was not a legal proceeding. It was a conversation with people whose homes were at stake, and they deserved to hear it from me directly. I started with the bank hold because that was the thing everyone was most afraid of. I explained what had caused the flagged electrical issue in Unit 17, not in vague terms, but specifically. I told them that the management office had been broken into and that paper records had been taken and that 2 days later the electrical interference was discovered. I told them that the security cameras installed at the beginning of the project had captured the incident at the office and that the digital access logs confirmed the timing and the entry point. I said that Brandon had been identified in the footage and that I had filed a report with the relevant authorities who were handling the investigation. The room was quiet in the particular way rooms get quiet when people are revising what they thought they knew. I did not linger on this. I did not ask for anyone's reaction. I moved immediately to the next item, which was the repair timeline. I pulled out the project schedule, printed 1 copy per household, which Denise had prepared, and walked through it section by section. The electrical system in Unit 17 would be replaced completely at my expense as part of a broader electrical upgrade across 8 units that had been on the assessment list since day 1. The bank hold would be lifted once the full assessment was submitted, which Sandra had already been working toward. The projected timeline for full rehabilitation had shifted by 3 weeks because of the delay. I said 3 weeks plainly, not apologetically, because 3 weeks was the actual number and there was no value in softening it. Then I talked about the rents. I pulled out the schedule I had filed with the bank as part of the original loan documentation, of public record that any resident could have requested at any time, and I read the numbers. The rents were staying at current levels for the full rehabilitation period with a modest adjustment after completion that was still below market rate for the area. I told them the adjustment was part of how the loan was structured, that it was fixed and documented, and that any resident who wanted to see the full filing could come to the management office and review it in person. Mara said something from her chair, not loudly but clearly enough. She said I was reading from documents I had written myself and that numbers on paper didn't mean I would actually follow them. I acknowledged that she'd said it. Then I told the room that Sandra Kowalski, my attorney, would be available at the management office the following morning to answer any legal questions about the terms of the loan and the obligations it created. I gave them Sandra's direct line. I did not respond to Mara's point beyond that because the room was full of people who had just heard that Brandon had sabotaged the electrical system of a vacant unit to frame the project as unsafe, and I did not need to argue with anyone about credibility. The footage existed, the records existed, the loan documents existed. What I needed to do was let people think. The shift in the room happened gradually. It wasn't dramatic. No one stood up and changed sides or made a speech. It was quieter than that. A woman named Rosa, who had lived in number 8 for 12 years and who I remembered from the maintenance forms she used to bring to me, raised her hand and asked whether the plumbing assessment for her unit was still on schedule. I said yes and gave her the specific week. A man near the back asked whether the common area in the courtyard would be included in the renovation. I said yes and showed him where it appeared on the schedule. A third resident asked about the process for reporting maintenance issues going forward. Denise walked her through it. These were practical questions from people who were deciding in real time whether the project I was describing was the same project they had been told was a cover for something else. Every practical question answered honestly was a small recalibration. By the time we reached the end of the scheduled agenda, the temperature in the room was different from what it had been at the beginning. Mara spoke again near the end. She stood up this time, which was a choice, and she said that I had come back to this neighborhood not because I cared about the people in it, but because I wanted to own something that my family had been part of and that I was using their lives as the stage for something that was really about me. I let her finish. Then I said that I understood she felt that way, and that I wasn't going to argue about my motivations. I told the room that the work being done was documented, the commitments were legally binding, and that the residents had every right to hold me to them. I told them that the management office was open, that Denise was reachable, and that if anyone had concerns at any point, there was a process for raising them that didn't involve community meetings organized by people who had taken money from this household before and had not been held accountable for it. I did not look at Mara when I said that last part. I said it to the room because the room was who I was talking to. The meeting ended. People filed out. Several came to the table to pick up the printed schedules. Mrs. Delgado stopped in front of me on her way out and said she was glad someone was finally doing something real. I thanked her. She walked out. Gordon stayed until nearly everyone else had gone. He stood near the back of the room with his hands in his pockets and the look of a man who had been waiting for the right moment and had run out of moments. He said he was sorry. He said it once, not elaborately. I told him I heard him and that I hoped things went better for him going forward. Then I turned back to the table and started packing up the remaining documents because there was still a great deal of work to do and the day wasn't finished. The bank lifted the hold 9 days later after Sandra submitted the full assessment and repair plan for Unit 17 alongside documentation of the incident that had caused the interference. The investigation into Brandon's actions moved through the appropriate channels without any involvement from me beyond the initial report. The repairs proceeded. The residents who had blocked access before the meeting mostly opened their doors after it. The electrical work took 2 weeks in the affected units. The plumbing upgrades took longer spread across the full rehabilitation period because you don't rush plumbing, and anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to sell you something. I fulfilled every commitment I had made in that room. Mara's situation resolved itself according to its own logic, which is to say, according to the choices she kept making after it became clear that those choices would have consequences. I had given her and Gordon the same offer I gave every other tenant: a new lease at the current rent level, a documented path to address the outstanding balance from the period before I took over, and a clear set of terms going forward. The balance was real. The previous management company had been lenient about it in ways that had created the illusion that the debt wasn't there, but I had inherited the full records and the debt was there, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise to anyone. Mara rejected the offer. She did this not impulsively, but with the calculation of someone who believed that if she held out long enough, I would eventually come to her with better terms. This was the same approach she had always used: outlast the situation, let the other person become the one who needed the resolution more. It had worked on me before. It had worked on people other than me. She had no particular reason to believe it wouldn't work again. What she didn't account for was that I was no longer the person she had to outlast. I was the property owner, and the lease structure meant that the consequences of non-compliance were not mine to feel. The violations accumulated over several months: unpaid rent, disruption of management operations, refusal to allow scheduled maintenance access. Each one was documented. Each one was addressed through the formal process with written notices and legally required waiting periods and every procedural step that the law required. I did not move faster than the process allowed. I did not move slower. When the threshold for termination was reached, I filed the paperwork. Mara Gordon and Brandon left the property. I was not there when they left. I was in a meeting across town about a different project, which is how it should have been, not because I was avoiding the moment, but because the moment didn't require me. The process had run its course. The outcome was the outcome. The house that had been mine for 3 years became something else within the year. I had been thinking about what to do with it since before the rehabilitation was finished, and the answer when it came was not complicated. There are women who leave situations they shouldn't have had to leave, who find themselves with a suitcase and a couch to sleep on, and a window of time in which they are trying to figure out the next step. What they need in those weeks is not charity. It is time and stability and access to the kind of support that helps someone build something real, rather than simply survive until the immediate crisis passes. I had been that woman. I knew what had made the difference, and I knew what had been missing. I converted the unit into transitional housing for women who had left their families under circumstances not entirely unlike mine. The program worked with a local employment services organization to provide job placement support. The length of stay was limited because the goal was transition, not permanence. I had learned enough from years of property management to know that permanence in the wrong place is its own kind of trap. A few years after the rehabilitation was complete, I walked those streets again. The gutters were clear. The walks were repaired. The porch lights all worked. The courtyard that had been a neglected afterthought was something people actually used in the evenings with chairs. Someone had arranged around a table and lights someone had strung along the fence. Mrs. Delgado was on her porch and waved as I went by. The family in number 14, the one whose heating had been broken for 6 weeks when I first got there, had put a new planter by their door. I stood in front of the house that had once been mine, and I looked at it the way I had looked at it that first Sunday morning when I had come back alone. The porch light was working. The mailbox post was straight. The windows were clear. I had not fixed those things because of what had happened inside them. I had fixed them because they needed fixing, and fixing things that needed fixing was what I did. The two facts existed separately, which was how I had learned to hold most things that were true at the same time. The suitcase was in my office. I had put it there not as a monument to the night I'd left, but as a reminder of what a person can carry when they decide to stop putting it down in the wrong place and wait for someone else to pick it up. I walked to my car. I had a meeting in an hour and the city traffic was already building. I put on my seatbelt and pulled out of the parking spot and drove toward the work that was still ahead of me. That was enough. It was more than enough. Here's what I keep coming back to, years after all of this. Mara had the locks changed the same night she threw the suitcase out. She was that certain I wouldn't be back. She was that certain it was over. The people who take the most from us are often the ones who understand us least. They mistake our patience for weakness, our consistency for dependence, our willingness to show up as proof that we'll keep showing up no matter what. They don't see the difference between someone who stays because they have to and someone who stays because they're still choosing to. And they never think about what happens when the choice changes. If you're the person in your family who holds everything together, who pays the bills, fields the calls, solves the problems, and gets blamed for the ones that don't get solved. This is not a story about revenge. It's a story about what becomes possible when you stop using your energy to maintain a situation that was never fair to begin with and start putting it somewhere it can actually grow. You don't have to buy a neighborhood. You just have to decide that what you build next belongs to you. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and come back. There are more of them about people who were counted out, who left with nothing, and who built something real from exactly that starting point. You're not alone in it, and you're not at the end of your story. Not even close.